So we are live again there. Excellent. So I mentioned I had gone back and looked at what we had talked about last week, and I want to share a little bit of that in the way of a review. I know you had mentioned you had watched the recording, and that's why we do this. I know, like we were talking about before we started here, that sometimes schedules just don't line up. And I have that with the classes that I teach too, is sometimes the schedule works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's nice to go back to it after the fact and review or think about what we talked about. So that's what this is a little bit of an opportunity to revisit some of those things. And one of the words that kept popping up as I went back to that first class was talk about being intentional. And I know Hank and Donna had talked about setting patterns at home. And Laura, you had mentioned that as well. And I talked a little bit about the experiences that we have here. And a lot of that was just tied to the busyness that we're used to when things are normal. And running to sports and trying to manage school and all the other activities that we have, whether it's church connections or family connections or work connections, whatever it might be. And we had started to get into also the growing of relationships and how that really needs to be an intentional thing too. We talked about how distant some of us are from our church and how we thought there were great people in the church and people that we would like to know better and spend more time with and get to know. And sometimes that is an intentional effort. If I'm going to see someone, if I'm going to get to know someone, even the many things that we have at church, we live in Maple Grove, so we're 20-25 minutes away. Even, small little things at church sometimes that are outside of the normal, like, yes, we're going to be there on Sunday, we're going to be there on Wednesday night. It's a trip. And I know that's the case for a lot of people. Is we have some people that are right around the corner, and we've got some people that are fairly distant. And I like, and I've heard some of the different small groups that we have are just people that happen to find themselves in a similar neighborhood. So naturally, that's the small group. We're here, we're close by, and some of them, in the midst of everything that we're going through right now, those are the people that are kind of checking in on each other and taking care of each other. So that becomes more natural when it's easier, right? When someone's right around the corner. And it's true of so many different things in our life, but especially church relationships and talking about getting into that rhythm of personal devotions and family devotions and so on is, if it's not, I don't know, necessarily on the calendar, although I challenged some of the high school kids to do that. I said, we talked about personal devotions and personal growth early in the year. I'm like, do we need to put that in our phone, right? So like a reminder pops up like, hey, God's ready for you. It's time for you to check in and do that. And I joked with them. I'm like, would you be willing to snooze God if the alarm went off and it said, hey, it's time? So we started this past weekend on Sunday night, a unit that came with a little devotional that I found. And it's one page per day. And I asked them, how long would that take you, do you think, to read through that page? And someone said, oh, probably about 2 to 3 minutes. I'm like, do you think you could find 2 to 3 minutes in your day? That's all I'm asking for, right? It's just 2 to 3 minutes to dive into that. And it had some Bible verses and encouragement to memorize, like a one-liner Bible verse. I'm like, revisit that. Take a peek at it at lunch and remind yourself what the verse was, and take a look at it at the end of the day and see if it relates to the things that happen. But it's funny how, you'll fill your time with so many different things. And that is the one thing, unfortunately, I think a lot of us struggle with, is neglecting that quiet time. You get done watching your 5 hours of Netflix for the night, and it's time to go to bed, and you're like, man, I just ran out of time today. I didn't have time to open my Bible. And I thought maybe this is a good quarantine quote. I heard from someone about 2 years ago. He said he had a card, and you were supposed to write down 5 people that you were going to be in prayer for. And he said, go ahead and slide that into your Bible, or put it on the fridge, whichever one you open the most. And I thought, ooh, right? We talked about that last week in some of the preaching group that I've been a part of with some of the retired pastors and Pastor Adam. And someone said, you got to eat. every day, right? We don't neglect feeding ourselves every day. And when it comes to your spiritual growth, again, that intentionality, you got to eat. You got to do it. So any thoughts or reflection on, I think that was a big word for us last week, is just finding a way to be intentional about some of these things. If you have some thoughts on that, we can definitely go back to that. I wanted to put this out there again. I think this is just so important. And I know I linked it to the recording and I had emailed it out to those who were here last week. This is an exercise, and I'll admit I had done it before. I didn't do it again here this time, just kind of a mental exercise. But to think about that, and maybe Barb and Sarah, you can share if you had any thoughts from the recording that you went through as to patterns that you observed in this. If you look at those 5 age categories and you think about people that are investing time and energy into you and people that you are investing time and energy into, and I'd put that one in the middle there, thinking about maybe a time past when you were in a different age group, and even someone who is the age that you are now investing into a previous you in one of these categories. Sarah, did you have any thoughts on that? People from different categories or things that you noticed?
Yeah, so, when I watched the recording, I was thinking similar to what other people were saying. A lot of people who are in your peer group, that's probably who influences me the most right now. But I mean, yeah, as a teacher, I have quite a few in that children category, right? And that does work both ways, right? A lot of it, you think about, oh yeah, I'm the teacher, so I'm, helping them develop in their faith. But yeah, you'd be surprised what kids will say sometimes, and just the faith of a child can, can really surprise me sometimes, and make me learn more about my faith and deepen my faith as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I volunteered twice this year in a 4th grade classroom and came away each morning when they started with their Bible time and their prayer time, like, wow, those kids can pray. Yeah. And some of them are very honest and very simple and very direct and some just everyday things that as an adult, you probably get to the point where you're like, well, I don't need to pray about those everyday things, but not just the simple stuff, but getting deep into some things and really having some great language in their prayer. I thought it was great. How about you, Barb? What do you think about that?
Well, probably the most people that are influential are in the 60 plus, but I do have many in all of the categories, actually. A grandson and his wife who are absolute inspiration to me, and how they deal with the ups and downs of life and being young parents, and their faith is very strong, and their children as well. Like you said, the prayers of a child, the little girl that talks all the time, is amazing, and had some of her insights too.
I had joked with a friend who's a grandparent. I'm like, what is, he had just become a grandparent and was talking about how special that was. And I asked him, I don't know that I'd ever asked my parents that question. And he said the coolest part about it was watching his kids now be parents, so not only the little ones, which I joke, they're a lot of fun when you can have fun with them and then give them back, right, when they get cranky. But he said, no, the biggest blessing is just watching my kids go through this opportunity to be parents. So, Laura, I know I asked you all these questions last week. You were a part of that. So I welcome you to jump in on that if you've got some additional thoughts now. But we'll roll forward here. Laura, I know this is a book that you're familiar with because we talked about this a couple of years ago, I think, just very briefly. And I mentioned last week during the class, some of these materials that I get exposed to come through the role that I played initially with our church as the youth leader and working with the kids. The Fuller Youth Institute, where Dr. Kara Powell comes from, is a part of a book called Growing Young, which we're going to touch on in 2 weeks, and Growing With, which we're going to touch on next week. And I've gone through some training with them. I've had an opportunity to spend time with them and doing some work with other churches through working with how do we incorporate youth better into the church, and all of these things I think come back to it's not just a youth focused effort, and it's not just youth leaders and volunteers in the youth, but it's such a big church thing. And I will throw out some statistics from this, and I wonder, in the role that I play now, working with people across all the age spectrum, and just being interested in church culture, and how do we all help each other grow if some of these things don't translate back and forth a little bit. So one of the things that they talked about, and I want to tie it into maybe that networking and that FaithWeb idea that we talked about. They said once upon a time, the law of youth ministry was you needed to have one adult for every 5 kids. You needed to make sure that you had enough coverage. You might think about that, Sarah, as the teacher to student ratio in the classroom, and what's proven to be effective there. And they flipped it with this book, and they said, no, every kid in the church needs 5 people that are keeping track of them, that are asking them real questions about their faith, not necessarily a formal mentoring situation. And that's a thought that I've had over the last few years, is I think that's great to have that mentoring relationship, but we also need a culture that just kind of naturally happens. There's a gentleman that I've worked with. He works for the Faith Formation Office with the Christian Reformed Church. He's an older gentleman. He's in that 60 plus category. And his rule, and people know this now at church, is he loves to chat with his friends after church, but he won't do it until he's checked in with the students. And he's not a formal youth leader in that way. He does a lot of work with youth ministry, but he's got to catch them first. Sometimes you got to catch the younger people in the church before they sneak away, right? You got to get to them before they have an opportunity to get out of there. So I kind of started thinking of this for myself, and I'll go through and welcome you to go through some of your experiences with different churches that you've been a part of in the past. But what are the things that made me stick in a particular church? And I think that's something that we can relate to anyone of any age, is how many people do you have at the church that you're really connected to, or that are looking out for you? And we had this as part of a small group for a while a couple of years ago, is I think you kind of naturally look for those people that are part of your small group when you come to church. And there's specific people that you get engaged with in ministry, whether you serve on council or you're a part of a particular group, or you've, for those of us who are cadet leaders, or I'm sure the women who are involved in gyms, is you just kind of naturally build these relationships with people that you're with. And then when you're in the church service, you look for them. That ratio becomes important with some numbers that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, as far as kids who float away from the church when they go to college. And my thought was too, we have somebody new who comes into Faith Church and comes to visit, and they stick for just a little bit and then they disappear. So was it maybe this? Was it that we didn't have this circle around them, or these people that were interested, these people that would seek them out as soon as the church service was done? And I know that can be difficult for new people that are coming in. And I think about a particular service. It was the first one we had the doors. Maybe one of the last ones we had the doors, because of when everything started going sideways there. But one of my boys was sitting next to me, and people were coming up, and we were doing, was it the ashes, writing our name with the ashes on the door, and said, wow, there's a lot of new people here at church today. And I noticed that there were a lot of people coming up there that I had never met before. And Sarah, I think at a Wednesday night supper, I sat with you and a couple of those people that we had recognized for the first time that morning. And I said, I need to, again, intentional. I need to make an intentional effort after the church service is over, is to fight the crowd and get to the back and find them and just say hello. And with the setup that we have now, which I do appreciate, that post-service faith formation hour, the time frame had just gotten a little too tight. And I knew the middle schoolers were going to be beating down the doors downstairs. So I had to sneak away, and I had to get ready for that. And I missed that opportunity that day to go and find them. But for someone new to come in the church, I think that deals with hospitality, which we could get into. Sarah, I know I just read a book that you had referenced that one weekend where we were together as a council, the I Am a Church Member.
Yeah.
And there's another one from that same individual. I'm looking Becoming a Welcoming Church, and has a lot of things about hospitality. And again, I'll hold this for a little bit until I get into my experience with different churches on my end. But how many times were we church shopping, if you want to call it that, when we were new in town and went into a church and no one noticed that you were new, and no one kind of captured you afterwards and at least said hello, and you just kind of floated in and floated out, and that was it. And I know some people, their personality, they might prefer that, right? Is just to get in and out without having to chat with someone new. But that's one of the reasons maybe why we didn't go back to a couple of churches. It's just like, we were here, we were new, no one even noticed. So we'll get back to that in just a moment here. But I think in community, and this comes directly from the Today devotional. And if you were not aware, and if you are on the Bridge app, you can connect to the Today devotional that maybe you're missing getting the physical copy of from church. They're talking about community right now. And the gentleman who wrote the series is actually a friend of mine who serves in the same role that I do in the church that Molly Kelderman goes to when she's in Colorado at school. And he and I have met through various youth ministry channels. And he asked this question, I believe it was yesterday. He said, in community, we all need to ask, who's mentoring us? And from whom are we learning the things that we need to know? And that's why I think that Faith Web is such an important exercise, is not only looking at, who's feeding me and who am I feeding, looking at both of them. It says in turn, who are we sharing the wisdom with that God has given us? And I think it's very real that you never get to that point where you stop needing someone to check in on you, or you stop needing someone to be feeding you spiritually. And to ask that question in line with that Faith Web is to say, okay, who's feeding me? Who am I feeding? And I just think it's a really cool idea to have someone from each one of those categories. Is to say, you know what, I don't have a 60 plus person in my church, or it doesn't have to be in the church, in my life. That's speaking wisdom into me. I need to find one. I know there would be many willing people in our church, a lot of great people at the seasoned citizens meetings. I love dropping in on those, who would love to have those conversations. I joke that Tina Woltersdorf, she's my church grandma. If I miss her a couple weeks in a row and I go to give her the hug, she's like, I was wondering when you were going to come find me, right? So she's looking out for me. I'm looking out for her, and it's nice to have that presence in that category, because I miss spending time with my grandma, who's probably a similar age there is to have my church grandma, right? And I'm sure for some who have kids that have moved away, or grandchildren that are elsewhere, to have a young person in the church that has a relationship with them. We've seen that a little bit with the prayer partners that we've done in the middle and high school group with the seasoned citizens, is showing up for one of them for my middle son's baseball games, and just showing up, and had people at the games thinking, ask me, is that your mom and dad? I'm like, no, they're just people from church, right? They're taking an interest in him. So thoughts on that? I'll get into, like I said, numbers in a little bit, but do you feel there's validity to that? Like, we need those, and maybe 5's not the magic number for an adult, but how many relationships is a good number to have in a church that would have you sticking there?
I don't know if there's a magic number either. I think it's definitely important. My brother-in-law visited, and we were talking about churches, because they just had a congregational meeting for their church, and they belong to a really small church. And he was saying, our church just isn't really wanting to grow at all, and they're in a small rural community, so he sees the problem as most of the people in the church have family members that they're spending a lot of time with, like their extended family takes a lot of their time. I don't think that's a problem for a lot of the people in our church, because we have a lot of people who are, you know, drop-ins from rural communities here in the city. But I think the question he asked, or the thing he raised, was he said during the quarantine or being at home, nobody from church has called and asked, how you doing? And I just started thinking about that, how meaningful that is if somebody just wants to know if you're okay, you know? So, yeah, I think it's pretty important to have a few of those people. I think if I have 1 to 3, and they're really good ones, I'm good. But more is great.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll talk about that in a little bit. When we moved into Wheaton and we're kind of bouncing around between churches, the reason we stuck at the one we stuck at. Some of it's the CRC familiarity and all the names on the mailboxes looking the same as what you recognize. But yeah, any other thoughts on that? Just the network within the church that keeps you there. Sometimes you can overlook a lot of the things that, no church is perfect, and you're going to have some things that you love about a church and some things you wish catered a little bit more to your personal preferences. But I think a lot of times it's the people that have you stick there. These are my people. These are the people that I've formed relationships with. Let me share a little bit of those stories, and I'm going to welcome you to talk about those too. So these are, and I recognized I missed one. I grew up in Calvary Christian Reformed Church in Pella, Iowa. When Pastor Adam asked us last year to figure out what our baptism date was, I did that and realized then, okay, if my baptism date was about 3 weeks after I was born, that means I was probably in that church, for not just Sunday morning services, but Sunday evening too, from the time I was 3 weeks old until the time I went off to college. So there's a lot of time spent in there. And the reason I stuck there was because that's where mom and dad were going, right? Is initially your church relationships are probably based on, where your family goes. I did have a time there. Third Reformed Church in town was, from what I heard, a much cooler church than the church that I was going to with mom and dad. And I was able to drive at that point. And there was a little bit of a disconnect between me and some people that were teaching our Sunday school class and so on. There's a much larger story there that I will tell you when we're not recording here. But I told my parents, I said, just right now, I wasn't getting out of it what I thought I should be getting out of it. And they said, well, as long as you go to Sunday school and church every week, I was welcome to go to that church, which I thought I needed to check out. And I did for a little while. And I had a good relationship with one of the students from that church, but never really got anything close to that 5-to-1 ratio in that particular church. No type of engagement. The music was a little hipper, right? The pastor was speaking my language a little bit more, and I thought that's what I needed, but came back then to Calvary Church because those were my people, right? Those were the people that looked out for me, and that was more important to me than necessarily having a more contemporary message or what have you. That's also the point in time where I probably grew up a little bit in my faith. And I remember the first 2 years of high school youth group just being bored, right? These people are not cool, right? They're not feeding me, probably like most of the kids, the younger kids in my youth group are saying about me right now. But when I got then to that second half, junior and senior, I decided that I was going to be actively engaged and I was going to be a part of making that work for me and making it work for the other kids. And then those same people who were probably doing the exact same things that they did the first 2 years I was in there, right? All of a sudden I'm like, wow, now everybody's great, right? So some of this I think is just a maturity, and we can all probably relate to that. So I mentioned the church shopping. We moved to Chicago. We were living in Wheaton, and I don't remember how many churches that we visited, But there was one I remembered, the one I was thinking about when I referenced it earlier, that we went to the church and loved the service and loved the music. And as far as that hour went for the service, was like, wow, that's everything we could hope for right there. And kind of walked slowly to the door afterwards, waiting for someone to recognize that we were new and capture us, and never did. I think we were even moving slowly in the parking lot, like just waiting for someone to say, hey, are you new here? They never did, and we never went back to that church, right? Is we loved the service, but no one made that personal connection. So we went to Wheaton CRC. I don't know why it wasn't the first one. I don't know if we were resisting it because that's the denomination that we grew up in. But the service gets over, and an older gentleman, 60 plus category, not the category that we were in at that time, grabs us and he says, "You're new here." And we said, "Yeah, this is our first time visiting." He's like, "I've got some people you need to meet." And he brought us downstairs where they were doing the cookies and the juice and connected us with a number of other young adult couples that were in the same age category that we're in. He's like, "I think they even have a Bible study. You should get plugged into that," right? And we quickly did. They had two different groups that met on two different nights, and those became friends of ours. They started having kids when we were having kids. They were buying houses when we were buying houses. We're kind of advancing through life stages together at the same time that we were, and remain now Facebook friends with them and keeping track of them. All because of this gentleman who I believe passed away within that first year that we had joined that church, had noticed us, wanted to get us connected. I've done this a little bit myself now too, is, someone that I may meet, Sarah, the group that you've been a part of with the young adults, I've gotten to know many of them through volunteer with youth leadership. If I see someone new come in that falls more in their age category than my age category, I'll introduce myself, I'll be friendly, and then say, "Hey, I need to introduce you to somebody." Not to pass them off, and not that I wouldn't be willing to, to build a relationship with them, but to feel or to think that they may be more comfortable with that person, or make a quicker connection with those group of people. And then Faith Church, and I'll ask you this question, is why have you stuck with where we're at? Maybe we can identify some strengths there. We were living in St. Michael when we moved here, and that's not real close to New Brighton. Maple Grove is not necessarily real close to New Brighton, but we checked out a few churches up there and never really made a connection. And part of what drew us in was the familiarity with the CRC. But quickly, I think other ways too that people can get engaged is to be given something to do, is to have a purpose at that church. Pastor Archie and I grew up in the same hometown, a couple of years apart, but he knew me, and he knew of my family, and found out that I had been a deacon at Wheaton Church, and there was some transitions going on with the council in our church, and he put my name in the ring. And he wanted to get me plugged in and doing something fairly quickly, and I did. And whether it's council leadership or any type of leadership or engagement in the church, I think once you have a purpose there, you just get more locked in, right? So, Barb, do you have any stories either from Faith Church or previous churches of how you stuck and where and why?
Well, Faith Church, it's all about relationships and friendships that have developed. And I think right from the start, we felt welcome and stayed. Of course, it's 50 some years ago. Mm-hmm. From a few other towns that we lived in, there were churches that we attended for a while, but nobody knew us. And don't remember ever anybody even talking to us in many of them. Yeah. We, 3 or 4 different towns we had lived in. So when we got here, it felt like home and stayed.
Yeah, felt like home. And you talked about relationships at Faith, and what you were saying about the other churches was relationship based too, right? Is that it wasn't there.
It wasn't
you, Sarah?
there. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so mine is actually very similar to yours, Travis. I mean, I grew up in the church, but really it comes down to relationships is why I've chosen the different churches I've attended. And really, for me, church has really become like a family to me. Growing up, my grandparents didn't live nearby. We didn't have extended family nearby. So growing up, the church was our family. Our small groups, and stuff like that. And yeah, even for me now, right? I don't live with family. I don't live near family, and so church kind of takes on that role for someone like me. And yeah, at Faith specifically, I got connected right away with the small group, the young adults group that I'm with, and that's really probably the biggest reason why I stuck. Because I started, hanging out with them, getting relationships with them. And so it was like, yeah, I want to keep on coming back. I don't want to keep on, shopping around for different churches because then I'm missing a Sunday. I'm missing seeing these people. So yeah, it really does kind of boil down to the relationships.
I love that young adults group because that's not something that anybody in leadership said, we need to formally start a young adult. It just happened. They started hanging out together. There's some structure and consistency to it from what I understand, but it's not like, okay, we meet every such and such, it just kind of grew organically. And I think that's great. And it's boosted the number of people in that age category that are part of our church and so valuable to us right now in leadership and participation in so many different ways. So I think that's great. Yeah. How about you, Laura?
Well, when we moved to the Twin Cities, we kind of just checked out CRC churches too, because we're Christian school teachers and that just seems like the thing we should do. And that's what the tradition John was raised in. And we were living in St. Louis Park when we moved here. So we checked out Calvary too, because that was really close. But then when we bought a house, we bought it in Mounds View. So Faith seemed to be better, not having to drive way down to Edina on the weekends too. So we chose Faith, but also just because the worship styles were pretty different. And we liked the worship style at Faith. The first Sunday we visited, Larry and Bonnie Overload invited us for a meal. So I attribute their welcoming spirit to making us want to come back. And then I think what kept us in was what Sarah is saying. In the early 2000s, there was a large group of young people, both single and married without kids. And then gradually everybody started to have kids, and it was just a lot of fun. And a lot of those people, like I said last week, have left our church. So it was a different feel then for us than now. But the group that I felt at home also with at church was the choir, because I really liked working with Rachel, and there was a big choir at that time. So I still, on the wall at home, have the gift the choir gave us when Caleb was born. So that was our little community within the church.
Nice. Yeah. Absolutely. I want to get back to some of these numbers, and I've got another story. I actually have invited us to lunch story too. It was Leah Kuipers that grabbed us. I think we had some very young kids when we moved here. So admittedly, I would be the spy who would go to the first time by myself to every church to check it out before we drug the whole family in, which is maybe something to think about with young families and comfort with nursery and knowing what's going on and to have a feel for what that is before they show up. But the first time that we were all there together, we were invited to lunch, and that's a great thing. Food is always a good relationship builder too, right? So this 5-to-1 and the research that Fuller did, and this is student specific, is the numbers showed them that 40 to 50% of students leave the church after high school, and 30 to 60% of those return in their late 20s. There's a whole nother graphic here that I didn't pull. It's actually from the Growing Young book. There used to be this very straight line where you would graduate from high school and you would go to college, and a lot of times you would get married late in college or right away after, and then you would start a family, and you got to the point where you were at that age, you'd hit those milestones much earlier, and that's when people would reconnect to the church. But now we've got this, not even necessarily going to college. Maybe you have a gap year or you travel. Or when it comes to relationships, maybe it's not marriage, but the reality that people are living together, or living in a more communal situation, and kids are happening later, and settling into maybe this specific career that you're going to be a part of long term happens much later, and they go from this straight line to this one that's just all over the place. And so that return time, people just kind of naturally like, okay, I'm going to college, I'm going to worry about other things, and I'll get back to that. They've said that 40 to 70% though of those 30 to 60% never do come back. So that could be a whole deeper conversation and so on. But the one that I thought was interesting here was 20% of those kids in high school had already decided when they got done with high school they were done. Right? Is they weren't going to stick in church. They we're going to graduate from high school, we're going to graduate from church, and we're just going to be done with this. And that's from a little while back. Maybe the numbers are a little bit different now. I've put a number of books on different generations and what their feelings are on faith and so on. But that 80%, and this is of the 40 to 50% that left the church after high school, 80% intended to stick it out, but it didn't happen. Right? Is for some reason they floated away. And I was thinking about my own college experience. Like I said, the last 2 years of high school, my church relationships, the youth group relationships, a lot of it because of my personal maturity, growth in that area. Like I felt like I would stick like that. That was, not something that I planned on leaving, but you get to college and you're away from, especially for a college kid that's hanging out with friends on Saturday night, and then church is going to happen way too early in the morning. One of the churches in our town in Ames, Iowa State had it figured out. Is church was at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And I had a cousin from Pella that I really wasn't even that close with. She was a year older than me, 2 years older than me, had gone to Iowa State, and she said she found out where I was living. They were meeting at that time in a middle school, not too far from there. I can't remember if she picked me up or we walked. I know it was close. And she said, hey, I go to church out by you. Let's go. You should go with me on Sunday. And she's like, I think I remember her saying that it was in the afternoon, so I didn't have an excuse, right? Go hang out Friday night or Saturday night, and my Saturday night wildness was like video games with the guys, right? But it was still late at night watching movies or playing video games. But to say like, hey, church is in the middle of the afternoon. But there's also statistics there that first 2 weeks for a college student are so critical, right? Because you're making decisions on what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do, and the values that you take from home and from church experience and so on into college. And then you get hit with all these other things in the first 2 weeks, and what are you going to do with it, right? And part of that could be too, if you get on campus and you don't plug into a church, in the first 2 weeks that might not happen. So there's a whole section of that book and other material that I've read as far as helping kids to think about before they graduate. Well, what would you be looking for in a church, right? Or your visits to the school before they get there, visiting a church, being part of that. Or I know I had talked to your Caleb, Laura, and to Caleb and Aragon too before they had moved, and I know Dort's a very faith-based community, but I think even when a kid goes off to a Christian college, you don't want to assume that they'll just go find it themselves and get plugged in. So I had called for Caleb and Aragon going to Valparaiso, called around to CRC churches in the neighborhood, say, before I realized Valparaiso had a faith element to it as well, is saying, well, what's around and what churches are close and so on. And I had someone in our classes at this last classes meeting from Canada saying, hey, my daughter's looking at a couple of colleges. Are you someone as the youth champion for the classes that can help us find a church for her when she gets there? And I'm like, yeah, we need to do that between these different classes and the champions within the group to say, if somebody from a different classes or a church within our classes is sending a kid to the Minneapolis area, to know what's close to the campus they're going to, because sometimes distance is going to be a thing, right? It's not necessarily going to be CRC to CRC, but to help find those people. I was part of a non-CRC group at Iowa State, but got plugged in, as I mentioned, by my cousin. That little church that was meeting in a middle school now is like, it's one of the biggest buildings in the that's not affiliated with the university in the town. They've got a spot right next to the interstate, and every time we drive back through there on I-35 to go between here and Pella, where I grew up, it gets bigger, right? As they're growing and growing and growing, because they figured it out, right? How to connect with those students. So, any thoughts on these numbers? Do they surprise you? I'm not the researcher, so if you dispute it, I can't argue it. But
I've done quite a bit of listening to podcasts and reading too, and yeah, this is the trend. So I think you have to be intentional. I mean, we talked to Caleb about it before, but he's an intentional kid too. So he already had made a list of the churches he wanted to scope out in Sioux Center. And then after about 2 months, he kind of settled on one, and I was surprised by the one he chose. I mean, it was a really big one, and I don't know that he's gotten plugged in personally there, because we went with him and nobody talked to us. So it was one of those kind of church size, but I think he chose it more for who else was going, like the group that he could connect with the other students, and the pastor was engaging. So yeah.
By the
But
way,
I've heard too that, well, college kids, if they encourage them, and if you are going to get in the church, don't just go on Sunday, actually like go to a Sunday school class too, and get to know some intergenerational people there.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope he does that still, if and when he goes back. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think as as family and church family for these kids, I think too, I mentioned Molly earlier in her connection with a friend who wrote the Today. I believe that was a family connection that area made someone to look out for them.
Yeah, the Skuttingas. Yep,
Yeah.
they used to go to our church.
It's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the ones that stick though, they talk about in the book are the kids that have this 5-to-1 ratio. So when I think about that in terms of the larger church, so someone new comes in, are we connecting them to opportunities? Are we connected? Do we have a little network of people that are looking out for them? Right. Some of that is if you have a small group of people that you're connected with, they recognize when you're there and you're not there, and can check in on you.
Yeah.
And I think that 2-week thing too that they talk about with the college kids is, if someone shows up at our church for 2 weeks and doesn't get some sort of connection or doesn't have somebody looking out for them. I personally struggle with that a little bit. There's a couple in our church right now that I talked to the first time that they were there, and then I didn't see them for a while. I'm like, oh, did I scare them away? Was I too aggressive? Like, hey, if you need to know anything, I'm your guy, right? Or you want me to introduce you to people or so on. I think sometimes, I know some of us do struggle with it, and there's different personalities too, whether you're the type to seek someone out who's brand new, but, let them know that they're there. Hey, I see you.
Yeah.
I saw that you're here. And I kind of left it at that morning was, if you need help finding anything or anybody, we were sitting right next to them, let me know. If not, hope to see you again, that type of thing. So it puts the ball in their court.
Mm-hmm.
2 quick things that I want to touch on to close here. I'd like to connect some of what we're talking to some various pieces of scripture here. And we've got Hebrews that spurring one another on towards love and good deeds. I think those relationships that we've talked about here tonight, that's where a lot of that comes from. If you've got a small group or a peer group or some type of engagement that you're involved with the church, that's where you can encourage one another, and that's where you can be fed not just by the church service, but by those church people. This next one's a little problematic, not give up meeting together. That's not our fault right now, right? That just happened to us. But what I love right now, and it's progressed so nicely in these videotaped church services that we have, is the number of faces that I get to see each week from different families that are involved in music or people reading scriptures or praying for us. And I just think that's shows the importance of the community aspect and the relationships that we value.
I love that too.
Yeah, so nice.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All of them, but even to this last week with the little kids and their little sunshines, right? Is just
Oh, I loved it.
oh man. I'm like, I think this is the same song we saw last week, and all of a sudden they added stuff in. I'm like, oh, it's the same, but it's different. It's so much
Yeah.
better.
It was so cool.
Yeah.
So good. Yeah. And I love too, little Sam Hogeveen singing a solo, or Abraham Vogel with his amen, amen, amen a couple of weeks ago. I'm like, yes,
Right.
yes. Yeah, that's an area you can mark them in your youth category there now on your faith
Yeah.
web, people that are speaking to you.
And
This-
I keep thinking, how can we keep this going when we're meeting together? We need some of this still somehow.
For sure. Yeah, the logistics of moving people on and off a stage is difficult, but
Right.
it needs to be a part of it. Maybe some pre-produced videos once we're able to
Yeah.
get back together.
With the little kids, then they're just so, they're not worried about being in front of people.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And then
Yeah.
there'll be future leaders in the church, right? And that's the way
Yes.
too, even at the youngest ages, to get people plugged in and connected and the purpose there.
Yeah.
The second one here from Proverbs, this is a big one for the Monday night group that I'm a part of, and the group that I was part of that I came from before then, and kind of the network of these Bible studies is, iron sharpens iron. We get together on Monday nights. We're doing it on Zoom now, like everything else in the world happening on Zoom. And it's just so important for us to keep getting together and to hear from these other gentlemen in my group, their perspective on the passage in the study that we're going through, and to check in on each other and relate the word of God to the things that are going on in our life. And, that it sharpens each other. As I move from one group to the next, and I was part of a group of guys that I had not been introduced to before I jumped into this new study. And we brought this up because this verse was a part of our previous group. And one of the guys goes, "Hey, I've got that on my sweatshirt." And he did. He had his sweatshirt had that verse on his arm. And one guy actually had it tattooed on his arm. Well, he did you one better there. It's with him all the time. But that's been a big thing for us is, iron sharpens iron. We're going to help strengthen each other. We're going to get real about the conversations that we have about the Bible. We're going to get different people's perspectives. And I only see those guys, most of them for only an hour a week there, and don't do a lot of stuff necessarily with them or see them outside of that hour. But those are people that I'm close to. It's people that I've been a part of for a long time there. So I think that is important too. And I wanted to introduce this today and maybe get back to it a little bit later. Do we recognize these symbols? If you've got an iPod or if you've got a phone with music on it, maybe you recognize these. Same Fuller group. I hate to keep relating everything back to my Fuller experiences, but I talked to a gentleman in Grand Rapids, was it about a year ago? Was it September? He's writing a book on intergenerational church and the influence of grandparents on their grandchildren when it comes to the faith. And I think he's a little ways away from that, but he had an earlier book, kind of a small group, but I think it was really just produced for his church, but he had a copy. And one of the other guys with us is like, "Hey, can I get a copy?" And he's like, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you want one too?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, if you're giving away free books, I'll take it." And these are the symbols that he used for something that we talked about a little bit last week, and that's whether we have a multi-generational church or an intergenerational church. So these are the symbols on an iPod for music for either repeat or shuffle. And that's not necessarily the most important thing, but the trees we talked about last week, where we may be in the same soil, we may be in the same building for an hour and a half or 2 hours on a Sunday, but we're just kind of circling each other. We don't ever actually cross paths with the 60 plus group, the 30 to 60, these other groups that we have, unless maybe we intentionally, the shuffle there where the arrows actually intersect and they cross. And I think that word we started with today, intentional, needs to be a part of making that happen, because we're going to naturally gravitate to the people we know, and we're going to naturally gravitate a lot of times to our peer groups. And I think that's good. We need that support. We need those relationships there. But maybe to build into something like a Wednesday night supper or an after church activity. We talked at classes with a smaller church, and they have maybe too few people in different age groups to really divide up and say, okay, third graders here, fourth graders here, and so on. So their faith formation hour, if you use the words that we use, is everyone from all generations going into their fellowship hall and mixing up at tables and going through the same material together. So they're still feeding them from that church education standpoint. It's a necessity because of the size of their church, but I thought it was a great thing if we were to have a faith formation, and again, when we get back together, right? But we could do it like this too, for those who can connect online, is to say, okay, let's mix the generations intentionally. Let's make sure that they're crossing paths. Let's make sure it's not the elementary kids in one room, the middle school kids in one room, and the adults over here learning things. Important to learn the things that are appropriate to us. But how do we set up some of these activities to make sure that we're mixing? How do we make sure if we're having a Wednesday night supper that the tables are getting mixed up a little bit? I don't know that, someone comes in, they get a seating assignment or something, but it would be good to say, hey, make sure you talk to somebody that you don't know or you don't know well, even if it's for 5 minutes, right? Or to facilitate something like we talked about last week, where we have just a little panel where we have a middle schooler, a high schooler, a young adult, someone in that 30 to 45, and then a 45 to 60, and then a 60 plus, and just ask them the same questions and kind of facilitate those conversations between them. Because when we did that at that conference, it was not only valuable to the people that were on stage, but to all of us that were listening. Is to say, oh, I'm learning something about this other generation, or that's a good question. I know somebody, I need to go back to my church and ask that question. Or even the idea of facilitating people getting together and crossing paths. So I encourage you to think about that between this week and next week. I know we're, sometimes when it comes to intergenerational, my worry in this stage, and I know it's been mentioned here tonight, people that maybe are quarantined away from church and not getting checked on. That's one of my worries in this stage with even our church too, is not only is someone not getting checked on, but some people just aren't going to be as connected to technology as the rest of us. So are they finding the church service? Are there opportunities for them to connect? How do we get it to them? My grandmother right now is in a care facility, and I know what they've done there is they've had people come. You can request. My sister did this with her 2 little kids. They had a FaceTime with Gigi, with great grandma, right? And got a picture from my sister of them talking. My son Logan wrote a letter to grandma as part of great grandma as part of a school assignment. And I've got her number in my phone, but she never calls me. I call her. She got that letter. She called me, right? Did you know that I got a letter from Logan, and they had a quick conversation over the phone, and I was able to talk to her. But there may be people out there that we need to help with technology, or get in touch with them in a different way. Have not necessarily just the younger people, but pockets of people from the church that are writing to someone who's maybe not technology driven, and get a letter in the mailbox, right? Show them that you're thinking about them, that kind of a situation. Any immediate thoughts on that? Otherwise, we'll save some of that conversation for next week. Part of next week also, and I have this book for anyone who's interested. Laura, I know you borrowed a copy, is this Growing With book that talks about the different stages of the faith development of kids. How they have different needs at different points. And I think it goes right into a new Christian walking in the door and what are their needs right now. That's one of the things I mentioned last week to be working on is, okay, someone brand new comes in, they're interested in being part of the community. they're not someone who grew up in the church or grew up in the Christian Reformed Church, where's the place that we have available for them to learn what they need to learn, to grow? And really, any of us at any stage, whether we were in church 3 weeks after we got baptized and never left, right? Or someone who's newer to the denomination or newer to the area, is just ways that we can plug in. So think about that for next week too, is what's been meaningful for you as far as education and faith development and plugging in. And we'll talk a little bit about that and the different stages that people go through in their faith development. And I think this piece, this intergenerational piece, is always important to be thinking about. Fair enough? Good. I appreciate you guys being here, and to anyone who's watching the recording, thanks for joining us after the fact. I'll pray for us and we'll turn you loose. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to have some dialogue this evening about faith that sticks. And the word last week was intentional, and we led with that this week. And I think the word of the week this week is relationships. And we've been thinking about that and talking about that already. And through the stories that we've heard and the examples that we've listened to here, we can see how important it is to care for each other and build relationships, and for someone to feel at home in our church because of the love of our people. And you said that in the Bible, that they will know that we are Christians, and they will know that we are your disciples by the way that we love one another. And I pray that we do that well, and we find opportunities to do that well face to face in that time in the future when we're able to resume some face-to-face connections and hopefully move towards some normalcy. And I pray that we would find good and new and creative and maybe go back to some old ideas as to how we can stay connected, to make a phone call or to write a letter to check in and our neighbors in the church and outside of the church. Please help us to be good witnesses to you, and just pray a blessing on our community wherever today finds us in the state that we are in. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for being here. It was good to see you guys. I hope you are all well.
Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.